Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and today in this video we are doing the first episode of our review thing, so that's going to be very fun. But yeah, episode 1 is all about Man of Steel. Man of Steel was an interesting movie to watch because it's different from all of the other Superman movies, you know? You got Superman Returns, you have Quest for Peace, we don't talk about that one. You have, Superman 1, Superman 2, Superman 3, all that stuff. And I think that this movie was the first Superman movie that tried to make it dark and gritty. And that in it is of itself a problem. And I'll explain to you this. Basically, there's no problem with making a character darker and more gritty to suit, modern audiences in a theater. The problem is that when dark and gritty goes against all of your character's core morals, you're breaking the character into core pieces and taking out the pieces that you don't like. But people came for Superman, not your interpretation of what you think is Superman. And I really feel like that was the beginning of all the problems, that Superman didn't feel like Superman. And I think that just because of that, people couldn't connect to Superman because nobody could relate to this dark person, that's basically just, not really engaging because it's so dark and gritty. And I think that the thing is, the first movie in a shared universe, unless like the whole genre is like a horror thing, I think that it should be like a more lighthearted film. And I think that that's just because if you're taking your films way too seriously before you've made any money on your first film, you have a problem. Batman v Superman suffered from this because it took itself way too seriously. They killed off Superman even though we had barely gotten to know him because we were alienated from him because, he's a different character, and he de-evolutionized as a character in Man of Steel. How are we supposed to get to know him, Batman v Superman should have been saved for way longer down the pipeline, but I'll get to that later in the next episode. So, Man of Steel. I guess I'll just talk about the positives first, the very few positives that there are. The score, Hans Zimmer was brilliant in this. The costume and set design was phenomenal, and the CGI made Superman look very godlike, and I guess that's kind of like what they were going for, which really gave it that Superman vibe. And the villain wasn't just one-dimensional. He had reason. It didn't have to be the strongest reason, but it still was a reason nonetheless. But yeah, unfortunately, that is where my praise for this movie ends. There are a lot of things that are wrong with it, and a lot of plot holes that are kind of irredeemable. Now, I think we should start off with what could have been. When looking at this Superman movie, I can only think of what could have been. I feel like when comparing the DCEU to the MCU, obviously the MCU being very successful, we see that all of the characters have very distinct personalities, but the DCEU only has characters that are dark and gritty at this point in time. And I think that that's one of the main problems. We can't connect to any of them if they're all the same and none of them are relatable. And I really feel like it takes away from the team dynamic, because if everyone's the same, there's no dynamic that's going on, which was very disappointing, unfortunately. But yeah, I would have liked to see a movie cross between Spider-Man 2 and Captain America: The First Avenger. Captain America: The First Avenger, because that's Captain America and Superman kind of reflect off of each other. They're both Boy Scouts, they're both campy and stuff, and they both, are very, they feel like they're back then, I guess. If someone curses, I bet that both of them would say language, not just Captain America. But yeah, and so I feel like that could also work, and then we could also see a Spider-Man 2 kind of aspect of it through seeing Clark Kent. We didn't see enough Clark Kent. We saw too much Superman. We didn't see him working that much at the Daily Planet. And I think that we could have done this thing where it shows that Clark Kent is this nerd and, like, nobody likes him, obviously, but then we see him as Superman, and then we can suddenly identify with him because we're like, yeah, that's me on the inside. I want to be free, and then, but they can also identify with, like, being not the cool kid, and I think that would have been very interesting to see, more Clark Kent and how he's, like, this really, like, loser kind of guy versus his alter ego as Superman, this, like, insane, like, mega beast guy. And I think that, that was a really wasted opportunity. Now, when I say plot holes, there are different kinds of plot holes. There are the ones where the second that something is revealed, you think of that plot hole. There are the ones where when you're walking home from the theater, you think of that plot hole. And then there are the ones where months later, or days later, or weeks later, or years later even, you think about a plot hole. If you have one of those that takes place years later, that's just normal. Every movie and franchise has some sort of plot hole like that. But the problem is that if you have certain plot holes that don't make any sense and you just put it in there, and when you were asked about it by, like, your executive producers or anything, you just said, nobody will notice, that's a bad sign. For example, why did Superman snap Zod's neck? He did not have to. He could have just, like, if you're strong enough to snap a Kryptonian's neck, you can literally just fly up and lift them up. It's really not that hard. You could have covered their eyes. I mean, I know that your hands are strong enough. You're a Kryptonian, and you could have done so many things, but he just didn't do them. And I think that that's the main problem with this movie. Superman wasn't that smart. He didn't use a lot of the ideas that could have been used. I wanted it to be where it seems like a hopeless situation. Zod's about to destroy everything and terraform the world into a new Krypton, and then Superman comes up with an idea that almost all of the audience doesn't even know that was possible. The audience were just like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I would have never thought about that. It proves to the audience that, Superman is intelligent, and, it's not just his brawn that makes him super. We're going to be talking about the stakes in the movie. Now, the problem with this movie is that there are no stakes that we're attached to. But, there's no stakes that we're attached to. There's nothing threatening anything that we care about because this is our first movie. So obviously we're not going to be caring about the stakes of the world if we don't even care about the heroes, We just don't care about the situation. So that's why I think that if you're making a first movie in a series, the stakes should not be world level. It shouldn't be like destroy the world. It should be more like an Iron Man movie, And obviously Superman, he's this big superhero guy, so obviously his stakes are most likely in a lot of movies going to be world level, but you could have started with a different hero like Batman, or, all these other heroes. But I do think that you could have done it with Superman. All you had to do was just go through the route of Lex Luthor. And this also makes it more compelling because the second that Superman finally thinks that he's gotten over the death of Krypton and the death of his parents, he meets General Zod, who, by the way, is another Kryptonian. By the way, can be leeway into new exposition for Krypton. And, it would be very compelling because now, Superman had just gotten over the destruction of Krypton, the death of all of his friends and family. Now he has to face a Kryptonian, and he either has to stop him and send him away, or let him destroy the world. And so it's this big sacrifice. But that is all I really have to say about this movie. I do think that it did have a lot of potential, but I do think that a lot of it was counted out by the fact that this movie tried to take itself way too seriously, and the characters were inconsistent with their comic book counterparts. And when your character is so famous in the comics that everyone knows his name, you've got a problem if you're going to try and change his character. And I think that if you're gonna do that, if you're gonna destroy the core moments and core elements of one of the most iconic characters of all time, that's not Superman. That's someone you're pretending to be Superman.